Tommy stood frozen in his lab at Stanford, gripping his phone so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His father's voice crackled through the receiver, casual as if discussing the weather. "I've transferred your research patent to your stepbrother, Mark. He deserves it more than you. He'll know how to properly commercialize it." Tommy could hardly believe what he had just heard. The breakthrough he had spent the last 5 years developing, the research that had consumed his entire life since graduate school, had just been handed away as if it were nothing. As if it were his father's to give. At 32, Tommy was a biochemical researcher specializing in targeted drug delivery systems. His work had the potential to revolutionize cancer treatment, making it more effective with fewer side effects. But none of that seemed to matter to his father, Robert Carter, CEO of Carter Pharmaceuticals. To him, business always came first. And now, it was clear Tommy was no longer a priority. "You can't do that," Tommy said, forcing his voice to remain steady despite the rage burning inside him. "Of course, I can," his father scoffed. "Carter Pharmaceuticals funded your research. Everything you develop belongs to the company. And as CEO, I decide who handles what." There was a pause, and Tommy could picture the smug smile on his father's face. "Mark has the business acumen you lack. He understands the market." Tommy's eyes flickered to his computer screen, where an email from the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office sat open, confirming receipt of his independent patent application 3 months ago. His father had no idea. Tommy had seen this coming. Ever since his father remarried 2 years ago, he had been systematically pushed aside. Key projects were reassigned. His funding was quietly reduced. And now, this final betrayal. "Well," Tommy said carefully, keeping his tone neutral, "I hope Mark enjoys trying to commercialize research he doesn't understand." There was another pause. His father had expected resistance, perhaps tears, pleading, even desperation. But Tommy's calm acceptance caught him off guard. That's all," Robert finally said. "I'll have legal send over the transfer papers." "Good luck with that," Tommy replied before hanging up. The moment the call ended, he sent a quick text to his lawyer, Sarah Martinez. "He did it. Just like we predicted." Then, Tommy sat down at his desk, hands shaking not from fear, but from anticipation. The wheels he had set in motion months ago were finally turning. His mind drifted back to the day everything changed, the day his father introduced his new wife, Deanne, and her son, Mark, at the company's annual charity gala. It had been one of the proudest nights of Tommy's life. He had just finished presenting his preliminary research findings to potential investors, and the response had been overwhelmingly positive. But instead of congratulating him, his father had turned the conversation toward Mark's recent MBA graduation. "Mark will be joining the company as head of strategic development," his father had announced. "He'll help modernize our approach, bring fresh perspectives." Tommy had stood there, listening as years of his hard work, his doctorate, his published research faded into the background. Suddenly, Mark was the new golden child. At first, Tommy had tried to collaborate, to share his knowledge. But it quickly became clear that Mark wasn't interested in learning. He wanted control. The signs were there from the beginning. Tommy's access to certain labs was restricted. His research team was gradually reassigned. His funding was cut. Then he started noticing Mark in meetings about his drug delivery system, taking notes, asking questions that revealed a fundamental lack of understanding of the science involved. That was when he contacted Sarah, an old friend from college who specialized in intellectual property law. "Document everything," she had advised. every email, every restriction, every change. And most importantly, file your own patent application independently of Carter Pharmaceuticals. So he did. He worked nights and weekends, carefully documenting every aspect of his research that wasn't directly funded by company resources. The breakthrough itself had come on his own time, using his personal lab equipment, meticulously logged and verified by independent witnesses. Now, as he sat at his desk, his phone buzzed with Sarah's reply. Papers filed with USPTO. Your independent patent application is solid. Their transfer attempt will trigger the investigation we've been waiting for. Tommy reached into his desk drawer, pulling out a thick folder labeled Project Shield. Every document, every email, every piece of evidence showing how his father and Mark had systematically tried to push him out and steal his research was inside. Another text from Sarah followed shortly after. By the way, that business acumen your stepbrother claims to have? I did some digging. His online MBA program isn't even accredited. Tommy wasn't surprised. Mark had always been more focused on appearances than substance. He spent more time posting on LinkedIn about being a pioneer in pharmaceutical business than actually understanding pharmaceutical development. His office phone rang Mark's extension. Tommy let it go to voicemail, already knowing what he would say. Sure enough, the message was exactly as expected. Tommy, we need to discuss the transfer of your research project. I have some ideas for monetization that you clearly haven't considered. Call me ASAP. Tommy smirked as he gathered his things. The next few hours were going to be crucial. The patent challenge would trigger an automatic investigation into the research's origins. Every document would be scrutinized. Every claim would be verified. His phone buzzed again, an email from the company's legal department. Tommy forwarded it to Sarah without opening it. As he stepped into the elevator heading to the parking garage, he reflected on how far things had come. His mother had co-founded Carter Pharmaceuticals alongside his father. She was the scientific genius, while his father handled the business. After she died of cancer, Tommy had dedicated himself to continuing her legacy, believing he and his father could honor her memory together. But everything changed after his father met Deanne. Suddenly, market value mattered more than scientific integrity. Research timelines were rushed. Protocols were shortened. And Mark's arrival had been the final straw. Another call came through his father again. Tommy let it go to voicemail. He had plenty to say before he tried to steal my research. Let him sweat. Tommy drove straight to Sarah's office, where she and her team were waiting. The conference room walls were covered with timelines, documents, the paper trail they had been building for months. Sarah glanced up as he entered. Right on schedule, she said. Your father just tried to file the patent transfer. As expected, it triggered immediate flags with USPTO. Tommy set his laptop on the table. How long until they realize? They probably already have. At that moment, his phone lit up with a text from his father. What have you done? Tommy showed it to Sarah, who nodded approvingly. Perfect. Let them sweat. Tommy sat at his desk, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the thick folder labeled Project Shield. Inside, meticulously documented evidence laid bare his father's and Mark's systematic attempts to push him out and steal his research. He had spent months preparing for this moment, and now, the time had come. The moment his father had tried to file the patent transfer, it had triggered exactly the response Tommy and his lawyer, Sarah Martinez, had anticipated: an immediate red flag at the United States Patent and Trademark Office, USPTO. The independent patent Tommy had filed 3 months earlier ensured that Carter Pharmaceuticals' attempt to claim ownership would not go unnoticed. His phone buzzed a message from Sarah. USPTO has flagged the transfer attempt. Their legal team is scrambling. Tommy leaned back, allowing himself a rare moment of satisfaction. The first real crack had appeared in his father's carefully curated empire. His office phone rang again, Mark's extension. He ignored it, already predicting the message his stepbrother would leave. Moments later, the voicemail alert popped up. Tommy, we need to talk. There's been a misunderstanding. Dad was just trying to help you. We can work this out together. Call me back ASAP. Tommy shook his head. A misunderstanding? They had tried to steal his research. Another call came through, this time from his father. Tommy let it ring. He had nothing to say. His father had made his choice, and now, he would face the consequences. The next morning, Tommy and Sarah arrived at Carter Pharmaceuticals headquarters. Through the glass walls of the building's lobby, he could see the commotion unfolding inside. Lawyers were moving in and out of offices, their faces drawn with stress. His father, Robert Carter, stood in the conference room, arms crossed, deep in conversation with his legal team. Mark sat beside him, his usual smugness absent. As they entered the lobby, Mark rushed toward them, his face pale. Tommy, listen, we need to call this off, he pleaded. Dad is furious, and this is making us all look bad. Tommy raised an eyebrow. Making you look bad? He let the words linger for a moment before continuing. You mean like trying to steal a patent you have no right to take? Mark forced a laugh, but it was unsteady. Come on, we're family. Carter Pharmaceuticals is a family company. Everything in it belongs to all of us. Tommy's expression hardened. Carter Biotech isn't family property. And neither is my research. Before Mark could respond, their father's voice boomed from across the room. Tommy. In my office. Now. Tommy turned to see his father standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. There was a time when that commanding tone would have made him hesitate. But that time had passed. Sarah stepped forward. Any discussions regarding the patent will take place with legal counsel present. We have a scheduled meeting with USPTO representatives in 20 minutes. His father's face darkened. This is a family matter. Tommy shook his head. No, this is a legal matter. You tried to transfer a patent you don't own. That's called fraud. The word fraud hung in the air like a thunderclap. Several employees passing through the lobby stopped to stare. Mark swallowed hard, his face turning red. Conference room. Now, Robert snapped. Tommy and Sarah followed his father into the meeting room, where the company's legal team sat waiting. Moments later, the USPTO representatives arrived. 2 women, Dr. Patricia Wong and Andrea Martinez, took their seats across the table. Dr. Wong wasted no time. We're here to address a serious issue. Yesterday, Carter Pharmaceuticals attempted to transfer patent application number 6397421 to Mark Carter. However, this patent was independently filed by Dr. Tommy Carter 3 months ago, with no corporate affiliation. There must be some mistake, Robert interjected. All research conducted by Tommy was done under Carter Pharmaceuticals' umbrella. Any resulting patents belong to the company. Sarah smiled, sliding a thick stack of documents across the table. Actually, We have extensive documentation proving that the key breakthroughs were developed independently using Dr. Carter's personal resources and time. For the next hour, Sarah methodically dismantled Carter Pharmaceuticals' case. She presented independent lab logs, financial records proving that Tommy had funded the crucial stages of the research himself, and emails showing a systematic attempt to push him out. Then came the final blow. We also have evidence that Mark Carter has been falsely representing his qualifications, Sarah continued. His claimed MBA is from an unaccredited institution, which raises serious concerns about the company's due diligence in attempting to transfer complex biochemical patents to his supervision. Mark's face drained of color. That's not relevant, he sputtered. My degree is just as valid as Tommy's. Tommy folded his arms. Then perhaps you can explain, right now, how my targeted drug delivery system works. Silence. Mark's gaze darted to his father, but Robert was staring down at the documents in front of him, his face ashen. Dr. Wong cleared her throat. Based on the evidence presented, it is clear that patent application number 6397421 was properly filed by Dr. Tommy Carter as an independent researcher. Any attempt to transfer it without his consent would constitute patent fraud. Andrea Martinez added, additionally, we will need to investigate the circumstances surrounding this attempted transfer. Patent fraud is a serious offense. Robert finally looked up, his expression a mix of anger and desperation. Tommy, you can't do this, he said. To the company. To our family. Tommy met his father's gaze. His voice was calm but cold. You mean the family that tried to steal my life's work? The family that pushed me aside for someone who doesn't even understand basic biochemistry? I was trying to protect you. Robert exploded. You're brilliant in the lab, but you don't understand business. Mark knows how to monetize research, how to make it profitable. Tommy laughed, but there was no humor in it. Like how he monetized his fake MBA? Or maybe like how he planned to monetize research he can't even comprehend? Mark burst into tears. His usual strategy when things didn't go his way. Robert slammed his hand on the table. What do you want, Tommy? Money? A promotion? Name your price. Tommy exchanged a glance with Sarah. This was the moment they had been waiting for. Sliding a folder across the table, Tommy said, I don't want anything from Carter Pharmaceuticals. I started my own company. My research, my patents, my future, they all go with me. His father picked up the documents, his hands trembling. You can't compete with us. Tommy smirked. You have Mark's expertise in making apps. I have actual science. Let's see which one investors prefer. As he and Sarah walked out of the building, Tommy's phone buzzed with an email from an investor. Interested in backing Carter Biotech. Sarah read over his shoulder and smiled. Ready to change the world? Tommy tucked the documents under his arm and nodded. More than ready. Tommy sat in the sleek conference room of Sarah Martinez's law firm, staring at the massive stack of documents spread across the table. The air buzzed with quiet energy, his team of lawyers and advisors working tirelessly as they finalized the next steps in his battle against Carter Pharmaceuticals. Across the table, Sarah leaned back in her chair, tapping a pen against her notepad. The transfer attempt was a disaster for them, she said. The USPTO has officially recognized your independent patent, and now Carter Pharmaceuticals is under investigation for attempted patent fraud. But we both know they won't stop here. Tommy nodded, his jaw tight. No, they won't. My father never admits defeat easily. He's going to try something else. And as if on cue, his phone buzzed. A message from his father. Let's discuss this like adults. There's still time to work something out. Tommy smirked. There was nothing to discuss. For years, he had watched his father transform Carter Pharmaceuticals from the research-driven company his mother had founded into a corporate machine obsessed with profits over innovation. After his stepmother, Deanne, and her son Mark entered the picture, the shift had only accelerated. Science had become secondary to marketability. Research was rushed, corners were cut, and suddenly, Tommy, the company's most accomplished scientist, was being pushed aside for someone who had an MBA from an unaccredited online program. He had tried to work with Mark, had attempted to share his knowledge, but Mark had never been interested in understanding the science. He wanted control. Now, Carter Pharmaceuticals was scrambling. They had tried to steal his research, failed spectacularly, and now they needed a way to save face. But Tommy had already moved on. Tommy picked up a pen and signed the final incorporation documents. Carter Biotech was now officially a reality. He had spent weeks assembling a team of scientists who, like him, had grown frustrated with the corporate politics at Carter Pharmaceuticals. Many had been eager to join him, excited by the chance to work on cutting-edge research without the interference of executives who only cared about the bottom line. His new company wasn't just about protecting his work, it was about creating something better. The moment the paperwork was finalized, Tommy's phone buzzed with an email from a potential investor. Investors had taken notice. The scientific community was rallying behind him. He was no longer just a researcher, he was becoming a symbol of resistance against corporate greed in the biotech industry. A few days later, as Tommy and his team were settling into their new lab space, Sarah stormed into his office, looking furious. Turn on the financial news. Now. Tommy grabbed the remote and switched on the TV. The screen cut to a live press conference from Carter Pharmaceuticals headquarters. His father stood at the podium, flanked by senior executives. Proud to announce our groundbreaking new drug delivery system, developed by our brilliant head of strategic development, Mark Carter. Tommy felt his stomach drop. Then, Mark stepped up to the microphone, wearing a lab coat like some kind of costume. We expect FDA approval within months, Mark continued, reading stiffly from a script. Our proprietary system uses targeted molecular recognition to deliver therapeutic agents directly to disease cells. Tommy's own words. The very language from his patent application. They're trying to steal it again, he muttered. Sarah was already dialing. Get me Judge Harrison. Yes, I know what time it is. This is an emergency injunction situation. Within hours, Tommy's legal team had filed for an immediate court order to block Carter Pharmaceuticals from making any public claims about his technology. But the damage was already done. Carter Pharmaceuticals wasn't just trying to steal his research, they were creating market confusion. Investors who had expressed interest in Carter Biotech were now hesitant, unsure of the patent dispute's outcome. Sarah sat across from him, arms crossed. We can fight this legally, but that's not enough. We need to go public. Tommy frowned. I prefer letting my work speak for itself. That's exactly what your father is counting on, she countered. He wants you to stay quiet, to remain professional, while he rewrites history. But you have the truth on your side. You need to tell your story. The next morning, Tommy sat down for an exclusive interview with the Wall Street Journal. He told them everything. About his mother's legacy. About being pushed aside for Mark. About how Carter Pharmaceuticals had attempted to steal his work, not once, but twice. He explained the science, breaking it down so that the world could see who had actually developed this breakthrough. The story went viral. Biotech battle. Researcher fights back against corporate theft. Scientists, industry leaders, and former colleagues rallied behind him. Carter Pharmaceuticals' reputation took a massive hit. Meanwhile, Mark attempted to do damage control, appearing in his own interviews to defend himself, but he crumbled under basic technical questions. Then came the final blow. Dr. Patricia Wong from USPTO issued a statement confirming that Tommy's independent patent was legally valid, and that Carter Pharmaceuticals' attempted transfer had been fraudulent. The company's stock plummeted. Tommy was in the lab, running tests with his team, when Deanne showed up unannounced. "You're destroying your father," she said. Tommy set down his pipette carefully. "He destroyed himself. I just refused to be collateral damage." "He built that company from nothing," she snapped. "No," Tommy corrected. "My mother built it. With real science. Not fraud and theft." Deanne's polished facade cracked slightly. "Tell me what you want. Money? A public apology? Name your price." Tommy studied her for a long moment before answering. "I want what's mine. My research. My patents. My reputation. Nothing more, nothing less." Days later, as Tommy was reviewing grant applications, his phone buzzed. Dr. Charles Montgomery, from the FDA Advisory Board. "I heard about your work," Montgomery said. "Your targeted delivery system is impressive. We'd like you to present at next month's Innovation Summit." Tommy straightened in his chair. "I'd be honored." Meanwhile, Carter Pharmaceuticals was in complete meltdown. An FDA investigation revealed years of rushed trials and manipulated data. Investors pulled their support. The board of directors met in emergency session. The headline scrolled across the news. Carter Pharmaceuticals CEO steps down amid investigation. Tommy received a final text from his father. "Can we talk?" He considered deleting it. But instead, he typed back, "There's nothing left to say." Then, he turned off his phone and went back to work. Because the future wasn't in the past, it was in the science. And Carter Biotech was just getting started. Tommy sat in his lab, reviewing the latest results from their preliminary trials. The data was even better than expected. His targeted drug delivery system was showing unprecedented accuracy in attacking cancer cells while leaving healthy tissue untouched. This wasn't just a breakthrough, it was a revolution. Yet, despite this success, Carter Pharmaceuticals was still trying to cast a shadow over him. It had been weeks since his father and Mark had tried to steal his patent, and the fallout had been swift. The emergency injunction had legally prevented Carter Pharmaceuticals from making any further claims about his research. But their initial press conference had already sown doubt in the industry, making investors hesitate. His phone buzzed a message from Sarah. "FDA report dropping in 10 minutes. It's worse than we thought." Tommy exhaled sharply. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The FDA's investigation into Carter Pharmaceuticals had started as a result of their fraudulent patent transfer attempt. But as regulators dug deeper, they had uncovered far more than expected. Rushed clinical trials. Manipulated data. Ignored safety protocols. The findings were devastating. The headline scrolled across the screen. FDA investigation reveals years of safety violations at Carter Pharmaceuticals. The report detailed how, in recent years, the company had repeatedly cut corners to accelerate drug approvals, all to please investors. Some of the drugs they had pushed to market were now being reviewed for potential recalls, and lawsuits were already starting to pile up. Tommy watched the press conference from his office as a stern-looking FDA representative took the podium. The evidence gathered indicates a systemic disregard for patient safety in favor of profit-driven decision-making at Carter Pharmaceuticals, she announced. As a result, the agency is launching a full review of all research conducted under the company's leadership in the last 10 years. Tommy barely had time to process the impact of that statement when his phone rang. It was Dr. James Chen, his mother's old friend, and one of Carter Pharmaceuticals' most respected scientists. "Tommy," Dr. Chen said, his voice urgent. "The board just voted. Your father has been forced to step down." For a moment, Tommy couldn't speak. He had known this was coming, but hearing the words still sent a strange mix of emotions through him. Deanne, Mark, and the entire executive team are being removed, Dr. Chen continued. They're trying to salvage what's left of the company before it collapses completely. Tommy closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. His father, the man who had once controlled everything, had finally lost. The company his mother had built on scientific integrity had been corrupted beyond repair. Now, it was falling apart under the weight of its own deception. Later that evening, Sarah arrived at the lab, holding up her tablet with a triumphant smile. "It's official," she said. "Investors are pulling out of Carter Pharmaceuticals. Their stock has dropped nearly 60% in one day. And guess what?" She turned the screen toward him. Venture capital firms were now pouring money into Carter Biotech. "The investors believe in your vision, not your father's," Sarah said. "You're getting funding offers from some of the biggest names in biotech." Tommy scanned the messages flooding his inbox: offers for meetings, funding proposals, collaborations. He had one. Amidst the flood of emails, one message stood out. "Mark. Can we talk?" Tommy hesitated. His instinct was to ignore it. After everything, what was there to say? But curiosity won out. They met at a quiet cafe later that night. When Mark arrived, he looked different. No designer clothes. No perfectly styled hair. He looked small. "I'm sorry," Mark said the moment he sat down. "I know that doesn't fix anything, but I need to say it." Tommy studied him, looking for the manipulation he had grown used to. But instead, he saw something else. Regret. "Why did you do it?" Tommy asked. "You must have known you'd be exposed eventually." Mark stirred his coffee, staring down at the table. "Dad made it sound so simple. He said you were being selfish, that family companies needed to stick together. I believed him because I wanted to. I wanted to matter." He let out a small, bitter laugh. "But I never understood what you did. The science, the research, it was like a foreign language to me. I convinced myself it wasn't stealing, that it was just family resources being redistributed. But I was wrong." Tommy leaned back, exhaling slowly. For the first time, Mark was telling the truth. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed. A message from Dr. Chen. "The board wants to meet with you. They want to restore credibility to Carter Pharmaceuticals. They're considering bringing you back." Tommy stared at the screen. They think I can fix this, he muttered. Mark looked up, his expression cautious. Will you? Tommy thought about it. About his mother's legacy. About the scientists still working at Carter Pharmaceuticals, people like Dr. Chen, who had fought for real research, despite the corporate corruption. Then he thought about Carter Biotech. The company he had built with his own hands. The freedom to do research without interference, without executives who cared more about profit than progress. No, Tommy said finally. I've already got a company. One built on the principles my mother valued. Carter Pharmaceuticals isn't my future. Mark nodded slowly. I figured as much. Tommy glanced at him. And what about you? What happens next? Mark swallowed hard. I enrolled in community college. Studying basic chemistry. I want to understand the science this time. Not just pretend. For the first time, Tommy saw something new in Mark. Humility. Good, Tommy said sincerely. Do it right this time. The next morning, Tommy arrived early at his lab. The sun was rising, casting golden light across the equipment and whiteboards filled with breakthrough ideas. On his desk sat a small package. Inside was his mother's old lab notebook sent by Dr. Chen. Flipping through the pages, he noticed something written on the first page, in her handwriting. To my Tommy who sees the world not just as it is, but as it could be. Never let anyone dim your light or steal your dreams. You are capable of more than they know. Love, Mom. Tommy traced her words with his fingers, feeling a deep sense of peace. Sarah appeared in the doorway. Ready to change the world? She asked. Tommy smiled, clutching his mother's notebook. More than ready, he said. Because sometimes, the best revenge isn't about getting even. It's about getting better. The Carter Pharmaceuticals scandal had reached its boiling point. After weeks of corporate turmoil, legal battles, and public disgrace, Tommy had emerged victorious, his research and reputation intact. Carter Pharmaceuticals, once a titan in the biotech world, was now on the verge of collapse, with its executive team ousted, its stock price in free fall, and its name tarnished by years of fraud and unethical practices. But for Tommy, the war wasn't just about defeating his father or exposing Mark's incompetence, it was about proving that real science still mattered. That integrity mattered. And now, as the dust settled, one final piece of the story remained unresolved. A message from Mark had appeared on his phone the night before. Can we talk? For a long time, Tommy had considered ignoring it. After everything, what was left to say? But in the end, curiosity won out. They met at a quiet cafe, far from the towering glass headquarters of Carter Pharmaceuticals. Mark was already there when Tommy arrived, looking far less polished than usual. The designer suits and expensive watches were gone. His hair, always styled to perfection, was now slightly disheveled. And for the first time, he looked small. I wasn't sure you'd come, Mark admitted as Tommy sat down across from him. Tommy studied him for a moment before replying. I almost didn't. A silence stretched between them before Mark finally spoke. I wanted to say, I'm sorry. His voice was quiet, uncharacteristically sincere. I know that probably doesn't mean much after everything I did, but I need to say it anyway. Tommy folded his arms, watching him carefully. Why did you do it? Mark let out a small, bitter laugh. Because I wanted to matter. He stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, avoiding eye contact. Dad always made me feel like I had to prove something. That I had to be the best. And when you came along, this genius scientist, this person who actually understood what made the company great, I realized I could never compete with that. Tommy raised an eyebrow. So your solution was to try and steal my work? Mark exhaled sharply. I convinced myself it wasn't stealing. That it was just redistributing family resources. That's what Dad always said, everything in Carter Pharmaceuticals belonged to the family. And Dad always told me I was the one who had the business mind. That I was the one who could make it all work. So I believed him. His hands clenched into fists on the table. But I never understood the science. I tried to pretend, but deep down, I knew I didn't have a clue what I was talking about. And when things fell apart, when the media started asking me real questions about your research, I looked like an idiot. Tommy didn't deny it. Because it was true. Mark swallowed hard. You were right about everything. About Dad. About the company. About me. He hesitated before adding, and now, you've moved on. Carter Biotech is taking off, while I have nothing left. Tommy tilted his head. So what happens now? Mark hesitated. Then, for the first time since they had sat down, he looked Tommy straight in the eye. I enrolled in community college, he admitted. I'm studying basic chemistry. I want to actually understand the science this time, not just pretend. Tommy blinked in surprise. Of all the things Mark could have said, he hadn't expected that. For the first time, it seemed like Mark actually wanted to change. Good, Tommy said sincerely. Do it right this time. The next morning, Tommy was in his lab, running simulations on their latest drug formulations when his phone buzzed. A message from Dr. James Chen. The board wants to meet with you. They want to restore Carter Pharmaceuticals' credibility. They're considering offering you control. Tommy froze. Control? Of Carter Pharmaceuticals? The very company that had tried to erase him? That had stolen his work, pushed him out, and discarded his contributions? He thought about it for a long time. About what it would mean to step back into the empire his father had built, to try and fix what had been broken. But then, he looked around his lab. At the cutting-edge technology. At the research his team was conducting without interference from executives who cared more about stock prices than science. At Carter Biotech, the company he had built, where he set the rules. Tommy picked up his phone and sent a reply. Tell them I'm honored. But I already have a company. One built on the values my mother believed in. That evening, Tommy was in his office when the door opened. His father walked in. For the first time in his life, Robert Carter looked defeated. The powerful CEO who had once dictated Tommy's entire future now looked like a man who had lost everything. I suppose you're happy now, Robert said, sinking into a chair. The mighty Robert Carter, brought down by his own son. Tommy leaned back, arms crossed. You brought yourself down, he said. I just refused to let you take me with you. His father exhaled heavily. I was trying to protect the company. Tommy's eyes narrowed. No, you were trying to protect yourself. Mom built that company on scientific integrity, on actually helping people. You turned it into a game of quick profits and corner cutting. For a long time, Robert said nothing. Then, at last, he spoke. Catherine would be disappointed in me, wouldn't she? Tommy's voice was quiet but firm. Yes. His father looked around the lab, at the whiteboards covered in complex formulas, at the state-of-the-art equipment, at the scientists working passionately. You really did it, he murmured. You built this, on your own. No thanks to you, Tommy replied. His father exhaled. I don't suppose there's any way to fix this? Tommy studied him for a long moment before answering. Not between us, he said. But you can still fix yourself. Tell the truth. Take responsibility. Be someone Mom would have been proud of. For a moment, Robert looked like he might say something more. But then, he nodded slowly, stood up, and walked out the door. Tommy didn't watch him go. Instead, he turned back to his work. Later that night, Tommy sat in his office, reading his mother's old lab notebook. On the first page, in her handwriting, were words he had never seen before. To my Tommy who sees the world not just as it is, but as it could be. Never let anyone dim your light or steal your dreams. You are capable of more than they know. Love, Mom. A smile touched Tommy's lips. Sarah appeared in the doorway. Ready to change the world? Tommy closed the notebook, feeling more certain than ever. More than ready, he said. Because his future wasn't in the past. It was in the science. And Carter Biotech was just getting started. The sun had barely risen when Tommy stepped into his lab, but his team was already hard at work. Whiteboards filled with complex chemical structures and data points surrounded the room, the quiet hum of cutting-edge equipment creating a symphony of innovation. This was his space. His company. His future. Carter Biotech was no longer just an idea, it was a fully operational research powerhouse, fueled by the brightest minds in the industry. Unlike Carter Pharmaceuticals, here, science came first. There were no rushed deadlines dictated by stock prices, no executives prioritizing market trends over patient safety. Just pure research. Just progress. And the results were already exceeding expectations. The latest trial data sat open on Tommy's screen, confirming what he had long suspected. His targeted drug delivery system was more effective than anything currently on the market. The treatment precisely attacked cancer cells while leaving healthy tissue untouched, dramatically reducing side effects. This wasn't just about patents anymore. This could save lives. Sarah walked into his office, holding her tablet with a look of barely contained excitement. You need to see this, she said, sliding the screen across the desk. Tommy's eyes widened as he scanned the breaking news headline. Carter Pharmaceuticals CEO steps down amid scandal, federal investigations pending. A video clip played beneath the text, showing his father at a podium, reading from a prepared statement. In light of recent events and the ongoing FDA investigation, I am announcing my immediate resignation as CEO of Carter Pharmaceuticals, Robert Carter said, his voice stripped of its usual arrogance. I acknowledge that under my leadership, the company strayed from its founding principles, and for that, I take full responsibility. Tommy exhaled, feeling a strange mix of emotions. His father had spent years dismissing him, underestimating him, and trying to take credit for his work. And now, he had been forced to admit his failures to the world. You did it, Sarah said. Everything he built, everything he thought was invincible, it all came crashing down. Tommy shook his head. No. He did this to himself. Sarah smiled. Either way, it means one thing. Carter Pharmaceuticals is officially finished. Later that afternoon, Tommy sat in a conference room with a panel of venture capital investors, leaders from three of the biggest biotech funding firms in the country. Victoria Chong, the lead investor, leaned forward, her expression unreadable. Dr. Carter Pharmaceuticals was once the gold standard in the industry. Your mother built something remarkable before your father changed its course. But what we've seen from you, your vision, your research, your principles has convinced us of one thing. She slid a folder across the table. We want to back Carter Biotech. $50 million in series of funding. No strings attached. Just real science, done the right way. Tommy opened the folder, scanning the contract inside. $50 million. Enough to expand his lab, fund further clinical trials, and accelerate development of life-saving treatments. He looked up and smiled. Let's change the world. Later that night, as Tommy was locking up his office, his phone buzzed. A message from Mark. I know you don't owe me anything, but I wanted you to know I finished my first chemistry class today. I finally get why you love this stuff. Maybe one day, I'll be able to do something real, too. Tommy stared at the message for a long moment before typing back. Keep going. Because for the first time, Mark wasn't trying to fake his way into success, he was finally earning it. The next morning, Tommy arrived early at the lab, ready for another day of progress. On his desk sat a small package of familiar, well-worn leather notebook. His mother's old research journal, sent by Dr. James Chin. Curious, Tommy flipped it open, and on the first page, he found a handwritten message he had never seen before. To my Tommy, who sees the world not just as it is, but as it could be. Never let anyone dim your light or steal your dreams. You are capable of more than they know. Love, Mom. He traced his fingers over her words, feeling a warmth settle in his chest. She had always believed in him. Even when his father tried to cast him aside, even when Mark had tried to steal his work, even when the world doubted him, she had always known his potential. And now, he was finally living up to it. Sarah appeared in the doorway. So? What's next? Tommy closed the notebook, a determined smile on his face. We keep going, he said. Because we're just getting started. And this time, nothing would stand in his way.